right, so we're going to get started as people keep trickling in. So thanks everyone so much for joining. I'm Jimmy Doyle. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Luminate, and today I'm going to take you through our streaming viewership M tool. So film and TV streaming viewership tracks minutes watched for all US content on streaming services in the US. So we're able to see minutes watched and views. I'll explain kind of how we're calculating that views metric when we get into the demo. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through first a little bit of data and just show you some of how our data is actually being used day to day at the studios, people in research, how they might be looking at the data, and show you hopefully something that's a little bit interesting. And then we'll get into the actual product, show you how it works, answer hopefully any questions around it. And as you have questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. We'll be happy to answer them as the webinar is going. So let me actually move into the site right now, though, and take you through some data first. So the first thing I wanted to take you through is some data around Lord of the Rings. We published a newsletter about this that I wrote actually at the beginning of last month, and the story has shifted a little bit around Lord of the Rings. So I think it's a really interesting case because it shows just how things can kind of rally as a show goes on. So this is something that was in our Streaming Watch newsletter, something that you can definitely sign up for and get added to. It's a really great newsletter where myself and my colleagues write a lot of really interesting detailed reports around our streaming data. So something I definitely recommend subscribing to if you're interested. But this is what we're looking at for the Lord of the Rings. So the story around Lord of the Rings seems negative when you look at a chart like this one. We're looking at a comparison between this yellow line, which is going to represent season 1 of the Rings of Power, and then this green line, which is going to represent season 2. So there's going to be some big differences between these. There's a lot more viewership, of course, for season 1 than there is for season 2. We see it tracking a lot better for season 1 than season 2. We'll see that kind of big difference. And that's something that initially when we looked at this was concerning, that they had a really big opening for season 1. It premiered really well, even though it dropped off a little bit after that first episode. We'll see it having really steady viewership and actually gaining when it gets to the end of the season. So I'll keep rolling through things, but please, if you have any questions, write them down. At the very least, send them to us. Apologies that the chat seems like it might not be working. But so to recap, it seemed like this is a negative story around Lord of the Rings. This is something where we're seeing less viewership for that second season. We saw a really big drop off after that first batch of episodes. But what's been interesting as we dig in a little bit deeper into the data is that the show's not only stabilizing in terms of viewership, but it's actually starting to gain viewers again, which I found really interesting in terms of the show. So the thing that we were concerned about is we see this first episode had a really big viewership. So now we're looking at episodic trends. So this green line that I've hovered over is the first episode of the second season. And it did pretty good numbers, but we saw on that other chart, it was well below what we saw for season 1. But then we saw it really drop off when it got to that fourth episode after the first 3 episodes dropped it in a big batch. That was something that was really concerning when we saw 4 episodes worth of data. Things are shifting now, though, because you look at episode 5, episode 6, and episode 7, and they're actually gaining in terms of where they're peaking out at viewership every single week. So that's actually really positive for the title. We're seeing it have that gain. The other thing that's really interesting is what's going on here on Friday, September 20th, is we see a big pop for all of the other episodes of the show. And this is not a show that I watch specifically, so I had to go to my colleagues to get some contextual data around this. But from what I've heard around the show, there is a lot of press around the show that it's improving, that people are getting really into the season, that 6th episode was really good, and there was potentially a big battle that was coming up in it. And you can see in the data, people went and were like, oh crap, I got to catch up on this show. And you can see this big increase in data for every episode the show on that date, and we're seeing that people went back going to check out the show, and we're seeing it continue to get those gains for the 7th episode. So it does seem like people are starting to really move through the show. You know, school's fully back in session now. People are getting kind of their daily TV consumption under control. This is something where there's a path for shows to find those viewers later, especially if it's a show that has that quality. And certainly, at the very least, Rings of Power is not lacking in terms of money that's put on the screen. So that's something that I think is a really positive story for Amazon. I know they've been putting out their own numbers around how much consumption has been done on the title in the last 30 days. And that's something that we're seeing similar trends as well in terms of something maybe a little bit more positive for the title. What'll be interesting is they're planning to do 5 seasons of this show. So will they be able to actually gain back some of those viewers and become a real juggernaut show, which is something that I don't think we characterize it as like a out of this world juggernaut show. Those are the sort of numbers that we're seeing for something more like The Perfect Couple is something that had ridiculous numbers, and we'll get into a little bit of that as we go through. So let me give you a little bit of background on our actual streaming numbers and how we're actually getting to these numbers, because that's probably a question you're having. So if you're not familiar with Luminate, we have 2 big sides to our business. We have a music side of our business that powers the Billboard chart. So we are the source of truth for the music industry. We also have a long history in the film and TV business, where we're providing metadata to the film and TV industry, which includes budgets and ratings, DEI data, industry contact information. So with all of that expertise, it made a lot of sense for us to move into measurement. And what we really wanted to solve when we were moving into measurement is this problem with information asymmetry. We know the streamers, they love to post their own numbers when they feel like they're very positive around them, but they have all of these numbers around how their titles are doing, and nobody else has that data. So if you sell a show to a streamer, you don't necessarily know how it's performing. Maybe even if they do give you data on how your title performed, they're certainly not giving you data on how your competitors performed on that platform, how you're actually stacking up against other titles on the platform that you sold to. And then the other issue is the streamer that you sold that show to, they can't even tell you how you're comparing to a show on a different streamer because they don't have that data. So what's great about what we've done here is we're able to now see how titles are performing across all the streamers in a real apples to apples modeled way, so that we can understand how does a show on Apple TV really compare to a show on Netflix? And if I've got a sci-fi show on Apple TV, is that performing the way that these Netflix shows are when I go to sell something to Netflix? Is that something that I can then talk about that performance in that way? So as far as how it's put together, this is a real consumption metric. It's based on real consumption across real people using real TVs. So it is a modeled data set, just like every other streaming consumption metric out there in the market. It's modeled off of 2.5 million connected televisions. And then we're taking that data from those 2.5 million connected TVs and then extrapolating it out for the entire United States. It's an ACR model, so it's capturing everything that's coming across the screen of a smart TV. So it doesn't matter what service someone is using, what app they're using within that television. It's actually seeing everything at the screen level of the TV and then able to say, okay, this person's watching Ted Lasso season 2, episode 3, and they watched it for 15 minutes. So it gets that granular in terms of the data. We're then looking at other directional sources to understand that our data is accurate around data that we have from our parent company, Penske Media, on their 370 million monthly active users. We're also looking at public title level content engagement data. And then we wrap that all up with our amazing metadata so that we can actually get the contextual understanding of how that title is performing. It's really important to understand the release date for a title, what genre that title is, what's platform that title is on, to actually understand the data and look at it in that sophisticated way that we were looking at it at the beginning of this call. So as far as what we cover all the major streaming networks. The other thing that's really important to note about our metric is we're able to return results really, really quickly. So we're returning results on a 24-hour cadence. We measure our week Friday to Thursday, and then we'll have results that following Friday. But we're actually having results throughout the week on that 24-hour rolling basis. So that's something I can show you right here in the platform. Oops, here we go. So you'll see right now we're in the most up-to-date data that we can see within streaming viewership M. So we'll see it says this is the current week. It's partial because the week is not completed because it will end on Thursday. And we're seeing data up to October 1st, though. So we're seeing data up to yesterday's viewership. So we can really get something that's a lot more akin to overnights in the old world of TV. So we can see that overnight data, understand how titles were doing on the previous day, and see how things are doing in real time. So something like Inside Out 2 just released on Disney Plus. That's something where we can see this massive viewership. Disney's already bragging about how much viewership they're having, and that's something that's definitely reflected in our data as well. So we can pull up the full film chart and get a little bit more detailed here. So what we'll see when we actually get into the full film chart, we're going to chart the top 50. We've got data on a lot more than that. And we'll see the minutes watched for the week in question. We'll see the minutes watched for the previous week, the percent change around that viewership, our confidence in it. Our confidence will be high for everything in the top 50. And then we'll also see this views metric. And I know I promised to give an answer on how we're actually getting to that views metric. So the views here isn't unique viewership. What it is minutes watched divided by runtime equals views. So what it's really helpful with is getting us an average sense of how many people are seeing this title. It's really, really useful when we want to understand how something is performing with different runtimes. So a good example is right here, actually, at number 4 and 5 on the chart. So Will and Harper has 193 million minutes watched, whereas Killer Heat only has 178 million. But Killer Heat is a shorter title. And so Killer Heat with views is actually having 1.8 million views just in the last 5-day period. And then Will and Harper has 1.6 million views. So even though Will and Harper has more total minutes, it's also longer. So there are likely less people who are seeing that title than have actually seen Killer Heat. So it helps to understand that data a little bit deeper. I also find it really useful just because minutes can sometimes be so amorphous. Okay, this has 500 million minutes, but like, what does that mean? Like, are people seeing this project? How, when we think about the old way we used to understand TV ratings, it more was around a people count. And this can help us get a little bit closer to that people count when we're looking at views. We can also see when we click on a title here, previous chart performance. So something like Rebel Ridge has done really, really fantastic business for Netflix. We'll see when it premiered on our chart, it was number 1. It's been on number 1 for the last 3 weeks. This is going to be the first week that it's probably not going to land at number 1 on our chart. And we can see where all that historical chart performance lands. So go back and take it over to TV and show us a little bit of our TV chart and then dig into some TV data here. So we'll see similar things for the titles on our TV chart. Emily in Paris is an interesting example because they did a split release. When we look at that historical chart performance, it opens at number 2 for the most recent season. And then we'll see it dips down a little bit, and then it gets right back to number 2 when that next drop of releases comes out. And we can see that data in a lot more detail when I actually click in on the title. So here, right now, the time frame you see has changed from year to date here. We can select all sorts of different time frames that we want with titles. So year to date is just going to show me from release for this show since it released this year. But I could see something like the first 12 weeks of activity, last week, the current week. I could select whatever week I want if I just want to see the performance in week 38 or between week 38 and week 40. That can be really helpful. If I want to isolate whatever period I want to, that's something I can do really quickly and easily within our platform. We'll stick to year to date for now because I want to see kind of the macro trends around the title. So when I scroll down on the trends chart, we can actually see the activity on this title at a daily level. So we're looking right now at daily level data for Emily in Paris season 4. We can hover over any of these lines and see, okay, what was the actual minutes watched on that specific day? And you can see right here in terms of the release cadence for this, it had that split season release that Netflix is really fond of for their most popular shows now, where they'll release a batch of episodes, wait 3 or 4 weeks, and then release another batch of episodes. And you can see that performance right here in terms of the data. What's interesting is you'll see you have an increase and it really peaks out in that second batch of release as far as total viewership. Some of that's going to be because there's people going back and watching those other episodes. There's more minutes available of Emily in Paris season 4 at that time. But it also is a trend we see often with these split releases because they build up excitement for the show. And then in that second one, that's when people are really going to see the title. That's something we can see a bit more on the episodic lens of things. So as far as episodes, you look at this pie chart, most people are completing Emily in Paris largely. So we're seeing a nice sense of completion rate when we look at these pie charts. If the chart pieces start to get a lot smaller, that's problematic for a show. With this one, this is pretty positive. It doesn't seem like they're dropping off a lot of viewership. It makes sense. It's a pretty mature show. It's in season 4. But we can get an even better sense of that on this episode trends chart. So this is similar to what we were looking at for the Rings of Power, the episodic level daily data for the title. But we can actually see where it peaks out for the first episode of season 4. We're not getting quite that viewership for the first episode in the second batch, the 6th episode of season 4 when that releases. So it doesn't quite reach those heights of that first episode, but it's also not a very significant drop off, which is really positive. With a brand new show, you're going to see a ton of drop off after that first episode. People go in, they sample it, and then you start to see a lot of drop in that data. This is something where this is a real big hit show, so they're not having that sort of problem. We can also look at a bigger view at a specific streamer within our platform. So if I wanted to go maybe to Apple TV, and we can actually understand how are their titles doing. So similarly, I can update the time frame here. So if I wanted to just see what's this week's chart just for Apple, I can pull that up. I can see Bad Monkey's been doing really well for them. So is Slow Horses. And we can see what that chart looks like. Something that I think is always amazing is that Ted Lasso season 1 is somewhere in the top 10 of Apple's chart all the time. It's still a really, really big performer for them. We can see a little bit more of that if we actually take this into year to date and we look at Apple's TV shows. So we can see this is something that's kind of breaking news for us. Presumed Innocent just recently overtook Masters of the Air as the biggest show on Apple TV this year. It's only going to get more viewership as the rest of the year goes on. So that's something that I think is a really interesting story here. But then you'll also see Ted Lasso season 3. Of course, that's newer. But then season 2 and season 1 still right there in the top 10 of Apple TV's chart for the year to date. And we can go all the way down to the top 20 here. And you can also see what's interesting is there's a big drop off in terms of viewership for some of these, bottom 20 shows versus the big, 3 billion minutes that we're seeing for something like Presumed Innocent, which is a real true blue hit. We can also see this for movies, and we can even see this at a specific episode level. So this is because Presumed Innocent and Masters of the Air have been so dominant for them. It's going to really be dominated by them. But I think something that is positive for Apple is you're seeing that first episode of Bad Monkey right here at number 3. That's a newer show, so there's still more minutes to be accumulated for that title. But that's a really nice performance for that show, which in total minutes is not doing quite as well as something like Presumed Innocent or Masters of the Air, but it is getting more viewership. And that's, I think, the big thing for Apple right now is, how do you have more shows than just Ted Lasso that are getting you into that top 10? That's going to be really important for them moving forward. We also have, really my favorite tool is our comparison tool. So I actually put together a comparison that we can look at. So with Agatha All Along releasing right now, this is something that I thought would be a little bit interesting. What's great about this tool is it allows me to bring in up to 6 titles to compare the viewership in the same time scale. So what we're looking at right now is weeks 1 through 6. So this will be from the first week of release to the 6th week of release. So we don't have to look at these across the same weeks. We can actually look at how a title's performed since release across different titles. It makes it really easy to look at comparative titles and understand how they're performing relative to each other. So this is going to look like a lot of lines. I promise I'll walk through it here, but I wanted to see kind of the full scope of the Marvel project here in terms of the data that we have there. But this green line is Agatha. So the biggest concern here when we just generally look at this is it's a lot lower than a lot of the other Marvel titles. So this is something where we've seen this sort of atrophy from Marvel a little bit, where the titles are shrinking in terms of that big viewership size. Now, this is a show, I think, with a little bit of a smaller ambition as far as kind of how big they probably expect the title to be. So I think there's a chance that this is positive. And the bigger thing that's going to be something that we'll track as the weeks go on is how people are actually holding the show, which we can maybe see at the daily level a little bit better. So when we see this, what's nice here is you'll see kind of right at this data point where that viewership is peaking out for that first batch of 3 episodes. And then when that next episode is being released, we're still seeing the viewership right up at about where it was previously. So that's something where it seems like it's holding okay episode to episode. There's a lot more data to come in for that title. I'll take this out of the crazy looking daily view and back to the weekly, which is a little more understandable. The biggest thing that I thought was really interesting here is Moon Knight, which most people would characterize as something that didn't do well for Marvel, because I think people thought it didn't do well creatively for them, is a title that actually, and I'll expand it out to weeks 1 through 12 so we can see, this is a title that performed really, really well for them. This is, in the last couple of years, one of their best performing titles. It had really good viewership, and it held really well. It's not something where you see this big dip after the initial release. You actually see it gaining in viewership over those first 3 weeks. And then it holds really nicely as episodes 4, 5, and 6 are being released. And it still has a lot of viewership even a couple weeks after it's been released. So this is something that I think, to me, from the outside reading the trades, this was characterized as something that was a bit of a miss for them. As far as the viewership goes, whatever you think about quality of a show, this is something that performed really, really well for them, which I think was surprising. You'll see actually really nice completion for a lot of the Marvel shows. People who are watching them largely are getting through them. It's not something where we're seeing a ton of drop off on each show. So that's something that's positive too. You see that with Loki, big increase by the end of that second season. When we look at, trying to hover over this red line, Echo, this is one where we see a little bit bigger of a drop off, but that's also not a show that was released weekly. So this is one that is maybe something, once we get the full scope of Agatha's performance, this is something we'd look at as maybe worst performance. It has this big pop of viewership because they released all 5 episodes at once, but then we see it really deteriorate really quickly on that line. And that's something that we can see when we actually look at that total minutes view for those first 12 weeks of viewership. And Echo, it's a little bit shorter than some of these other shows. So mind you, that's part of the reason it's going to have less total minutes, but it's also really well behind things like Loki and Secret Invasion and Moon Knight in terms of that viewership. Now, Moon Knight excluded, Moon Knight has a 2 movie stars with Ethan Hawke and Oscar Isaac in it. Loki and Secret Invasion have characters from Marvel movies who are in them. Echo does not. So that's something that I think is worth keeping in mind with that title, but it is something that had a lot worse performance than we're seeing for some of the other Marvel titles, which is just something to keep track of. What I like about this view, though, is when we take it into this total minutes, it can help us understand even titles that have that different release cadence. So it's hard to look at those lines and say, oh, Echo did better than Moon Knight, because they're different in terms of just the way the line chart is going to go. But when we take it down to total minutes, that can help really open up how we're understanding this title. And then, of course, if I want to dig into any of it, I just click right through to the title, and then I can really dig into the data there. So then I can really get a sense here of, okay, this is how people are dropping off of Echo. A lot of people sampled that first episode, but then they fell off for the rest of the series. And it's something that didn't hold in that same way as a lot of the other Marvel titles have. And that's really the overview of what the service can do. I am going to try to get this chat back online if it seems like it's not something we were able to get going initially, but oh, here we go. I figured out how to fix it. I'm so sorry, everyone. So the chat is now working. I wish it were working the whole time, but if you have any questions, please throw them into the chat. We'll be happy to answer them. We have a few more minutes here. And then, of course, you can always reach us via email, and we can answer any other questions as well. So sorry about that, everyone. Well, if you do have any questions, please feel free to shoot them to me via email. You can send them to me, jdoyle, DOYLE, @luminatedata.com. You'll also be getting a follow-up email from us. So happy to take any of those questions. There are apologies that the chat was not working today on the call, but these things happen. All right. Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate your time. Thanks. Bye-bye.